Welcome to Direct Effect, Croatia's first EU law podcast. My name is Martin Stier, and for today's episode, I have the privilege of talking to FRONTEX's Fundamental Rights Officer, Jonas Grimheden. Mr. Grimheden, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Now,
Pleasure to be here.
First of all, I have to thank you for finding the time to do the podcast. I know you've been on a busy schedule. You've recently come from the border, from the Bosnian-Croatian border, so thank you. I have here my list of questions, and I thought about starting the interview with maybe some more basic questions regarding both FRONTEX, but also your job as a fundamental rights officer. So if you could give a small overview and explanation of what FRONTEX is and what is your role within FRONTEX.
Thanks a lot. So FRONTEX, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, is the largest and the most dynamic, expansive, expanding agency in the European Union. With a mandate to monitor and support the EU's external borders, but also beyond the borders. My specific mandate within that agency is to monitor fundamental rights, advise on fundamental rights, and hopefully also prevent fundamental rights violations to the extent we are more visible, we are known, people know what to do, what not to do, etc. So that's the basic purpose.
Mm-hmm. And if you could explain the agency FRONTEX in a couple of words.
Yeah. So in a way, it has a large mandate to support the member states and non-member states to some extent with border management. So policing borders, aerial surveillance, land borders, sea borders, providing boats, providing human resources, support in all possible ways,
Mm-hmm.
information gathering, and analysis, and bringing information together from all the countries.
Mm-hmm.
So we have sort of a comprehensive overview of the migration situation, the travelers, the people at the borders.
This is by far the biggest agency within the EU.
Yes.
Okay, and still growing.
Still growing. So the vision is for 2027 that there would be 10,000 or potentially 10,000 border guards. Currently, it's probably somewhere around 2,000-3,000.
Quite
expanding.
A big increase.
Yeah.
Now, as a fundamental rights officer, of course, you have a lot of people that you're accountable for. What would you say, which would be the most significant challenges you face from a day-to-day basis, but also in totality?
Yes. So the starting point is that we are independent. So I have an independent role. So I'm not reporting to the executive director of the agency, but to the management board. And the management board is prevented from telling me what to do. So that independence for me and for the staff, altogether 65 fundamental rights monitors and fundamental rights staff or experts in the fundamental rights office, we are independent. So we don't have to listen to or obey any orders that come from the agency as such. So we decide what to do. I decide ultimately what we should do. And that is, in a way, the first challenge that we have to insist on and be clear that this independence is crucial for our objective assessment, for our role.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the next challenge is to use this independence and objectivity, creating as much leverage and impact as possible. That is important. For that to happen, it's important that we are credible, that we are trustworthy within the organization and externally. So they have to know internally that they can trust, that they know that we advise them in the right way, that we are sort of a reliable business partner in the organization. And externally, they have to know that we are independent, that we say to the agency and to the member states what they need to hear in an objective and clear way, so that they don't see us as some window dressing or something less than what we are.
And which would be some of the mechanisms you have at your disposal to achieve these goals?
So I think the strongest one is that we have access to all databases, all places where FRONTEX is active. So we can go to the borders, like you mentioned, I just come from the border, and then they receive me, they show me around, I can ask any questions. That's true for the borders where FRONTEX is active, but also then the headquarters, getting access to databases, documents, processes, being involved in discussions, debates in the management board, in the executive board. So all the decision-making processes. And that's, of course, also very, very important to have leverage, to have impact.
If you could tell us maybe some of the most typical violations that you face with, which are probably most common in these border countries, being the Mediterranean countries, but also here in the Western Balkans.
I think there's some scenarios. Maybe I could give 3 different scenarios that sort of depicts the main problematic violations. So the ones that are the most important to me, that are the most serious, that are the most concerning. One is the Central Mediterranean or the Mediterranean scenario, where we have people drowning. Not the violation in itself, but if we don't do enough in terms of search and rescue, and if we don't do enough to try to help these people, or if we push them back to Libya in an incorrect way, that could amount to a violation if we're not supportive enough of a general search and rescue. So that's the first scenario. A second one is more the Aegean Sea, so not the agency, but the Greek Aegean Sea, Turkish Greek Sea, where we see people being returned either from land onto rubber boats, or being stopped in their own boats and put on less navigable rubber boats, or at the land border, similar activities that they are people are returned in a summary way. There's no correct process of how vulnerability is assessed if they claim asylum. This is not taken into consideration in some instances, and then they are summarily returned, collectively returned effectively. And the third scenario is maybe where the legislation is not compatible with EU law. That we have, for instance, in Lithuania, but also to some extent in the neighboring countries up in Northeast, where even the Court of Justice of the European Union has pronounced and said that the legislation in Lithuania is not in compliance. We said it also before the Court of Justice. I'm happy to state. And then the border guards are in effect following the law of the land, but the law of the land is not compatible with EU law and international standards. So, meaning the violations take place when they then return persons in an incorrect way.
Yeah. One of the things that I found pretty interesting, yesterday you held a class in the University of Zagreb, and you were speaking about the correlation between the border crossings that are more strictly guarded with border fences and more equipped, and the amount of violence that you see in those borders. And I found it pretty interesting, since it's an information that I haven't seen yet. So if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Thank you. So I think I stressed there at that lecture that I don't know it scientifically, but my impression is that if you don't provide for any vent, any possibility for people to come in or to interact with the border guards, if there's no possibility of getting asylum, or at least claim asylum and have the process start at least, if it's simply a fence that is impenetrable, there is no entrance, there's no one getting through, the level of aggression and violence increases. Is my strong impression from seeing a lot of the borders. Meaning that if you have a closed border, the frustration on the other side is so big that they resort to violence in a way that you don't see at other border crossing points.
Yeah. Are there specific border crossings that are, let's say, in a way notorious for having a lot of aggression there, a lot of tensions?
I think there's some clear places where we see that. I think there has been some riots, for instance, in the enclaves in Northern Africa, the Spanish enclaves. But I also think we see some of that in Hungary, where the legal regime, the national legal regime, is very strict, and people are returned and they have to seek asylum not at the border, but go back and seek asylum in capitals in the neighboring countries where it might not be possible to seek asylum. And I think, again, not scientifically proven yet, but I think there's it appears to me to be a correlation between that vent, that possibility to sort of, for some people to get through, for some people to have their voice heard and to make the claim for asylum heard, and the level of aggression.
Now, another interesting field is technology. And of course, with the introduction of artificial intelligence and other types of new technologies, a lot of fundamental rights, of course, face the danger of being violated. Now, how does technology impact the work of FRONTEX, specifically in this field?
So as a starting point, it's of course important that Frontex, as a supporter of member states and national authorities, that we are leading on technology, that we know what technology is helpful and sort of explore. That is taking place. Frontex is sort of commissioning research, analysis, how can we use technology, and sort of promoting that and sharing that with the member states. Some of the technology can, of course, be intrusive, so we have to be alert and be attentive to these risks and try to mitigate or avoid the risks. And ideally, we would even design technology or find technological solutions that are fundamental rights proof or even fundamental rights promoting by design, so that they don't come with a risk of violation, but maybe even helps to realize fundamental rights.
In regards to the work that Frontex and of course you do with NGOs, the UN, which is their role in the protection of human rights?
So you asked earlier on about some of the tools that I have, and I mentioned only one, sort of the monitoring capacity that we have, which is very important. One other tool that we have is a consultative forum. It's prescribed by EU law. So for the agency, this is a forum for the agency to be able to discuss in a more protected forum with civil society organizations, EU agencies, and international organizations, so including UNHCR, European Union Asylum Agency, and NGOs like Save the Children. And this protected forum, in a way, protected discussions, helps the agency to understand what are the concerns from civil society, from international organizations, and what could we do to sort of do a better job, sort of friendly fire or feedback in that sense. And I also draw on this consultative forum to a large extent, using them as sort of a discussion partner, someone that I can openly discuss with and raise problems. They know my job, they know the agency, and that's very helpful for me also to be able to have a frank discussion. Some of this, the work in law enforcement is of course a bit secretive. And for that reason, it's not so easy to have any NGO or any organization. But these organizations have come forward and have applied to be part of this consultative forum. And I think that's a very good, another type of vent, another type of forum for us to engage with.
And which would you say are some other tools that you have at your disposal?
Yeah, I mentioned already the fundamental rights monitors, which I think is the most crucial resource, and I think also the consultative forum that I mentioned is also very helpful. Other tools that we have includes complaints mechanism. So for persons that feel that their rights have been violated, they can complain, and that happens maybe a couple of times per week on average. Not all cases we are able to process because they might be too late, or they're not concerned with issues that relates to Frontex, or it's not an issue that is related to fundamental rights altogether. But a handful or two every year we are processing, and that's also adding to I think the credibility of the organization and the impact that we have on people's situations. Maybe an additional tool that I really draw a lot on, a lot of information that we are using to a great extent, is an internal reporting obligation. So for all the officers in the field, be it Frontex or national officers, if they are involved in a Frontex activity, if they come across or see or involved or do something that is a fundamental rights relevance for them, in their view, they should report directly to us. So they shouldn't report through the hierarchy if there's a risk that the hierarchy might reduce something of that information, but report directly to us. Through this, we know a lot about what is happening, not only at the borders where these officers work currently, but they also very often talk to migrants through various types of interviews that they conduct with migrants as part of their role as border guards. They also learn, and through them we learn about what happens at other borders. So it could very well be a migrant who is interviewed in Italy, who has tried to get into Europe in Greece at an earlier stage, and through the interview in Italy, we find out about the situation in the Greek border or a Bulgarian border, and that's a very, very helpful tool for the agency to know what are the problems and what are the routes, what are the the ways that the migrants come to Europe, but also certainly from a fundamental rights, a human rights perspective, that we learn a lot about what goes well and what goes wrong at the borders.
Now, if you could share with us a specific challenge or a specific case that you had to work on that had a big impact on you personally.
Yeah, some of the work that we do is very maybe emotional, that it's emotionally straining, that we see or read about or hear stories that are very tragic. People dying in the Mediterranean, people being beaten, losing their property, their clothes at times being treated in a very inhuman and degrading way. Some of those stories are very troublesome to process for me and my colleagues, and we also have a scheme in place to be able to deal with this, to talk to each other, to get professional help when needed, etc. But maybe for me, the one case that still troubles me is from a couple of years ago, and it's still not resolved. I don't want to tell. I don't want to share which country it is, but I think the story is problematic enough. So it's a person who on entering or on being in the European Union was gathered by police officers, put in a room with others, stripped naked for a few hours. Their property was stolen, and then they were transferred across the EU border to a third country. And this was a very strong and clear account, and a very credible person who gave this. And it also resonates with a number of other stories that we've heard of similar nature. And this person, usually we don't have the access to these migrants or these persons that report about these stories, but for various reasons, this person we had full access to, and we still have full access to him. So we have his account, but also other persons who were with him on this day when he was summarily expelled and collectively expelled to another country. And in order to deal with this case, it has to sort of get traction with the case. We've of course reported it in all the internal ways that we can, but also to make sure that it doesn't go away. I also reported it to the prosecutors in that country, and to make sure that the prosecutors and the judge and the courts are dealing with this case. The prosecutors also asked me to testify under oath about the details of this case, which I have done. And now I'm waiting for this case to deliver a final decision. So the courts, that they would come out with hopefully a clear pronouncement, a clear judgment, so that there's a precedence with this case, and the national authorities know that this happened according to the court, and it's not allowed, and it shouldn't happen again.
You've mentioned that you have some internal mechanisms to deal with this. Are these psychologists or?
So we have maybe a three-pronged approach. We have our own assessment, our own awareness, so training on how to deal with stress, psychological stress, and stories, tragic stories that we hear. A second level is sort of a peer process, where some of the colleagues are trained as peers to be able to have a conversation with their colleagues if they feel that it's not enough to simply deal with it yourself and to think about how to get over this yourself. And part of that is also a routine that we're developing, that maybe on the way home from the borders, from the border region, after maybe a week in the field, that you have a few triggering questions that you ask to your colleagues in the car, if there's two of you, and you ask, so what did you think about that difficult story that we heard, or that we read, or that we saw, and sort of talk about it with the colleague that you have. So either with the trained peers or with the colleagues in the car. And the third level would be professional help, where we are sort of on standby, a professional psychologist that can help us with processing more difficult cases.
Now, this is a Croatian-led podcast, and I asked you already before if you could comment a bit about the situation here in Croatia, which is one of the bordering states. So if it's not a problem.
No, I think we see problems in most countries, and that's not necessarily bad. Of course, we would like to have no problems, but I think it's also important that countries acknowledge problems, and that I've seen in Croatia, that there's a realization that everything is not done perfectly, and we need to improve, and that's really good. I spent a few hours this morning at an advisory board for the Croatian independent monitoring mechanism for border management, sort of an international advisory board that helps the mechanism that Croatia has established to monitor in a more effective way the borders. And also that is, I think, a very positive step, something that is concrete and something that is in a way a role model for other countries, or could become a role model for other countries where there is less of this national monitoring. So I guess those are a couple of positive things that I see in Croatia. But as with most other countries, there are certainly also cases that we are aware of where things are not going by the book. But it's important, again, that the countries don't try to reject this and say this didn't happen, but on the contrary say, we hope it didn't happen, but if it did happen, we will do our best to provide better routines, better operational procedures, better training, better capacity, better legislation, maybe even, to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
You've also mentioned that you have certain officers on the field. Now, which is the training that they have to undergo to become fundamental rights officers?
So the EU regulation that guides the work talks about fundamental rights monitors. So my role is as an officer, so I'm supposed to be the head of the office and lead the work and decide on the strategy, the approach, and then we have a number of monitors. And these monitors should be at least 40. We currently have 46 of these monitors, and they should be, when we recruit them, they should have knowledge of border management. They should have done some kind of monitoring, maybe for the OSCE or for United Nations in Afghanistan or something like that, that sort of gives them a good experience. They should ideally also know human rights. Some of them are former police officers that have worked for the UN. Others are more coming with an academic background and maybe worked for the Council of Europe, with the court. And yet others could be more coming from civil society and having worked with civil society in some form of monitoring. And then we are obliged to provide them with training. And that training consists of a number of things. Of course, border management, understanding how border management works, how FRONTEX works. But certainly also they have to know for security reasons, they have to know self-defense, they have to know first aid, medical and tactical medicine to understand and be able to interact if something happens. They also get training on things like personal protections or bulletproof vests and how to use that and sort of be careful and be not put themselves to overly big risks in the field. And we also have actually coming up driving skills, because a lot of the driving that you need to do to get to the green borders requires some at least some avoidance of potholes.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm from the countryside, so I think I know that from childhood. But some of the people that are used to only driving on paved roads, they need a bit of four-wheel driving skills and how to avoid potholes.
And you said there's 40 of them.
46 currently,
46.
And we hope to recruit another 6 early next year and another 20 or so in the coming couple of years.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, because 40 people doesn't sound enough to cover the entirety of the EU border.
True. I think we could have many more, but it's also has to be a manageable number. We have 200 plus places where Frontex is active. We have 20 countries maybe where Frontex is more engaged than in a significant way. But if Frontex also becomes active in countries outside of the European Union, far outside the European Union, in Africa, I think we will definitely need more people, just because of the consumption of human resources that would require.
Now, to end the episode with an interesting question regarding the future, of course, regarding the entire migration crisis that is happening now, but also what is expected to happen in the future. How do you see the future of the protection of fundamental rights, especially taking into consideration these changes?
So on migration, I think we inevitably will see more migration. You mentioned climate change, and I think that's a major trigger, war, starvation, etc. I think we inevitably will see more migration going forward. And I think it's not something we can prevent or reduce. We can manage it, and we can do it in a professional and correct way. So I think that's the clear vision. From my perspective, from a human rights, fundamental rights perspective, I think it's important that this management is done with a very, very strong and solid basis in international law and EU law to ensure that it's not only done in the way that border management ensures security, but also ensures that it's professional and rights compliant. For that to happen, I think the role that I have is a very interesting one, and I think we can achieve a lot. But I think also that going forward, we will need to have more impact. So, pardon the pun, but maybe more direct effect on the advice that we provide.
No, this as a student-led podcast, we ended the first episode with Professor Golden Lang this way. Do you have any advice that you would give to students?
It's a great question, and it makes me feel old because, of course, I used to be a student myself, but that's increasingly many years ago. I think for me, I did when I studied, I studied what I thought was interesting. Let me be concrete. So I studied Chinese language and Chinese law, but also, of course, regular law and international rights law. And everyone said to me that heard about this combination, well, that's a stupid combination. There is no human rights in China. Why would you combine that? And I said, I don't know. I just find both topics interesting. And the day I finished my master's degree, there was a job offer, and there was not even an application process because there was only one person in Sweden that had international rights law and Chinese background. So it wasn't a strategy. I just picked the two topics that I thought were interesting to me, and it led to something. And I think that mentality that approach has helped me many times later on. I do what I find interesting, and usually there's a job or an opportunity somewhere if you're open-minded and open to new ideas and new countries and new languages and new situations.
Okay.
So maybe that is my advice. Stay open and stay creative.
And on that note, I will end the podcast. Mr. Grimheden, it has been an honor talking to you, and it's a wrap.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks a lot.